Why had Rosalie Fenwick crossed a flooded Wyoming creek in the dead of night? And why did she hesitate when she saw what Graham had packed? Bang, bang, bang! Graham tore open the cabin door as rain stung his face. Rosalie stood barefoot in the mud, one hand scraped raw, her soaked dress whipping in the wind. "Can I stay with you tonight?" she whispered. Then lightning lit the room behind him, and her eyes fixed on the packed saddlebags. What was Graham about to do? "Tell me where you're listening from." The wind hit Graham Talbot's cabin hard enough to shake the latch. Rain swept sideways across the Wyoming foothills, rattling against the single window like thrown gravel. Graham looked up from the bridle he was mending beside the stove. For a moment he heard nothing but thunder. Then it came again. 3 blows against the door. Not a branch, a fist. Graham crossed the room and lifted the latch. Lightning split the yard white. Rosalie Fenwick stood on his porch. Her dark dress was soaked nearly black. Mud streaked to her knees. One glove was gone. Her bare hand was scraped across the palm, and wet strands of hair clung to her cheeks. She was breathing so hard she could barely speak. "Rosalie?" "My mare stumbled at the creek. I turned her loose before she broke a leg." She swallowed and looked past him into the cabin, then back toward the storm. "I walked from there." "You walked through that?" "I didn't have much choice." Thunder rolled over the hills. Still, she did not cross his threshold. Graham understood why. Briar Hollow lay less than half a mile away, but people in a small frontier settlement could stretch half a mile into 100 different stories by breakfast. Rosalie lowered her voice. "Can I stay with you tonight?" Graham stepped aside. "You nearly drowned getting home. That's all anybody needs to know." Something in her face loosened. She entered. Graham shut that door against the wind and went immediately to the stove. He added 2 pieces of split pine, set water heating, then pulled his driest wool blanket from the bed. "You're shivering." "I noticed." That almost made him smile. He hung a quilt from a roof beam to give her privacy and laid one of his clean shirts behind it. "I'll keep my back turned." "I know you will." Those 4 words stopped him for half a second. Then he faced the stove. When Rosalie emerged, the shirt hung nearly to her knees beneath the blanket. Graham handed her a dented tin cup of coffee. Their fingers came close without touching. Neither mentioned it. Rosalie sat beside the stove and slowly looked around. 1 chair, 1 narrow bed, 3 books, a rifle over the door, horse tack hung from wooden pegs, a battered coffee pot. Very little for a man who had lived nearly 40 years. Then she saw the saddlebags. They were packed and buckled beside a rolled bedroll. "How long have those been ready?" Graham kept his eyes on the fire. "Long enough." Her cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "You're leaving." 3 years earlier, Graham Talbot had ridden into Briar Hollow, expecting to work 1 month. August Fenwick had hired him after watching him settle a frightened gelding without once reaching for a whip. By summer's end, August had also learned that Graham reported a rotten fence post instead of hiding it, returned every borrowed tool to its proper hook, and could correct a young ranch hand without humiliating him. One evening, August found him drinking coffee on the porch. "You got family waiting somewhere?" "No." "Woman?" Graham gave him a look. August chuckled. "That answers that. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to give one reason to wait." August studied him. Some men are made for moving. Some just haven't found the reason to stop. Graham dismissed it with a shake of his head, but his eyes drifted toward the barn. Rosalie was inside, patiently working a restless mare around the pen. August noticed where Graham looked. Graham never noticed August watching him. That winter, August Fenwick died. After the burial, Graham found Rosalie at the kitchen table in the same black dress she had worn beside her father's grave. Bank papers covered the boards, a mortgage, renewals, interest. Years of debt August had hidden from his daughter. "He never told me," Rosalie said. Graham read the figures twice. "Your father was a proud man. Pride doesn't pay a bank." "No." Graham pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. "Work does." He stayed. 1 month became a season became a year, then another. Now, 3 years later, rain ran down Graham's window while Rosalie sat wrapped in his blanket, staring at the bags that said the man who had stayed through everything was preparing to become a drifter again. "A ranch several hundred miles west offered me a management position," he said. "When?" "A while back." "And you accepted?" Graham's jaw tightened. Before he could answer, a blast of wind struck the cabin. The lamp flames stretched thin and vanished. Darkness swallowed them. Rosalie could hear Graham moving toward the stove. She could hear the rain and the hard beat of her own heart. Then lightning flashed again. For one instant she saw his face, and she understood there was something he was refusing to tell her. Her voice came quietly through the dark. "Is this about Warren Bellamy?" Graham stopped moving. Outside, something heavy broke loose upstream and crashed into the swollen creek. Inside the cabin, Graham said nothing. Rosalie watched his outline in the stove glow. That silence was answer enough. But before Warren Bellamy had ever ridden into their valley, there had been 2 years when life between Graham's little homestead and Briar Hollow had seemed almost simple. After August died, Graham stayed through the spring, then summer. When a neighboring parcel came open, he bought enough ground for a cabin, a small barn, and pasture for 3 horses. His western fence met Briar Hollow's eastern line. Most mornings one of them crossed it before sunrise. Nobody ever arranged that. It simply happened. Rosalie would appear carrying 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth. Graham would bring a tin pot of coffee. He always poured hers first. She never asked why. The first real money Rosalie made after August's death came from the gray mare. August had bought the animal cheap because no one wanted her. She kicked stall boards, fought a halter, and once sent the old foreman over a rail fast enough to make Graham laugh for a week. Rosalie would not break her with fear. Every morning she entered the round pen quietly. No whip, no shouting, just patience. Graham watched from the fence as the mare slowly learned that Rosalie's hands meant no harm. One cold morning, the animal finally stood still beneath a saddle. Graham folded his arms over the top rail. "Your father would have asked twice what she's worth." Rosalie tightened the cinch. "Then I'll ask 3 times. "You'll never get it." She looked over. "Would you like to wager your coffee on that?" Graham wisely declined. 3 weeks later, a rancher paid her asking price. He returned before winter for another horse. The following spring, he bought 2. Rosalie recorded every sale in August's old ledger, then carried part of the money into town and came home with bank receipts folded inside her coat. Graham knew she was paying the mortgage. He never knew how much. Their lives settled into small habits. His spare gloves somehow remained at Briar Hollow one December. When he found them again, a split seam had been repaired with neat brown stitches. Rosalie knew he took his coffee black. Graham knew she hated weak coffee but drank it rather than insult whoever made it. They disagreed over fence posts, hay, breeding stock, and whether a north pasture gate needed replacing. "You're stubborn," Graham told her once. Rosalie planted both hands on her hips. "Shuh, you've been arguing with me 20 minutes. Because you're stubborn. And what does that make you?" The old foreman passed behind them carrying a shovel. Lord help whichever one finally marries the other. Neither spoke until he was well out of hearing. One evening, Rosalie stopped in the barn doorway when she heard Graham humming while repairing harness. For a second, her face went still. "My father used to do that." Graham stopped. "I still expect to hear him some mornings," she said, "coming through that door." He set the leather strap down. "Grief doesn't know it's overstayed its welcome." Rosalie looked at him a long time. Then she sat beside him while he worked. Another evening, Graham told her about a Colorado valley where autumn aspens made the mountains look afire. Why didn't you stay? Wasn't anything there worth staying for? Rosalie lowered her eyes to her coffee. And what would be? Graham had no answer. By the second year, everybody else seemed to have one. At the Sunday social, the Reverend's wife seated them side by side. We're not, Rosalie began. The woman was already gone. Graham studied his plate. She's not wrong that we look respectable enough together. Rosalie nearly dropped her fork. At Mrs. Pruitt's mercantile the next week, Rosalie ordered coffee. Mrs. Pruitt measured twice the usual amount. That's too much. Then I suppose you'll have to drink twice as much. Rosalie gave her a look. Mrs. Pruitt tied the sack without the faintest apology. Then Warren Bellamy came from Cheyenne. He rode a polished bay and wore a coat cut finer than anything usually seen around Briar Hollow. More important, he knew numbers. He knew about August's mortgage. His proposal was straightforward. Bellamy would clear the remaining note, purchase an interest in Briar Hollow, and give Rosalie's horses access to buyers farther east. Then came flowers, invitations, a new saddle blanket Rosalie had not asked for. Bellamy's business visits had become courtship before Graham was willing to call them that. One afternoon, Bellamy watched Graham repairing a bridle outside the barn. A ranch like Briar Hollow needs capital behind it, he said. Not good intentions and a hired man's wages. Graham's hands stopped. Rosalie answered before he could. That hired man kept Briar Hollow standing when men with considerably more money wouldn't have lasted through February. Bellamy smiled thinly. Graham should have heard her defense. Instead, he heard only two words. Hired man. That night, he sat alone in his cabin with an offer from a large ranch several hundred miles away. Management, steady wages, responsibility that belonged to him. He read it twice, then signed his acceptance. Outside his window, Rosalie crossed the Briar Hollow porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. She stopped when she saw his lamp. For several seconds she stood there with the second cup in her hand. Graham never looked up. At last Rosalie turned around and carried both cups back inside. Now, with the storm beating against his cabin 3 years after he'd first come to Briar Hollow, that second cup seemed to stand between them. Rosalie sat wrapped in his blanket while the stove threw a low orange glow across the room. Did you take the job? Graham did not pretend to misunderstand. Yes. The word was quiet. It hurt more for being quiet. When were you planning to tell me? Tomorrow. You were leaving tomorrow. I was going to tell you before I rode. Rosalie stared at him. Water dripped steadily from her dress where it hung near the stove. That's generous. Rosalie. Why? Graham looked toward the dark window. Good wages. Better than I've made here. They need somebody to manage the horse operation. It's steady work. You have steady work. Not the same kind. What kind is it then? He rubbed a thumb across the rim of his coffee cup. My own future. Rosalie's expression changed. For 3 years, Graham had been part of nearly every hard day Briar Hollow had endured. Frozen troughs, broken fences, sick horses, August's debt. Now he spoke as though those years belonged to somebody else's life. And Warren Bellamy? Graham's jaw tightened. He can clear the note. I know what he offered. He has buyers from Cheyenne East. Capital enough to expand your breeding stock. Men working for him. Connections. And Briar Hollow doesn't need me the way it did. Rosalie slowly set her cup down. There it was. Not the whole truth, but enough of it. You've decided I'm marrying him. Graham looked at her sharply. I never said that. You decided enough to leave. That's not fair. No? Thunder rolled somewhere farther into the hills. Graham stood. You deserve security, Rosalie. Bellamy can give you that. I've got a few acres, some savings in a tin box, and a horse I've spent half my life packing. Did I ever tell you what I deserved? He said nothing. Did I ever tell you I wanted Warren Bellamy? Again, nothing. Rosalie stood now too, the blanket gathered around her shoulders. Did you ever once ask what I wanted from you? Graham looked away. Some things a man ought to see without making a woman say them. Rosalie gave a small, disbelieving shake of her head. Then perhaps you've spent so much of your life looking down roads, you've forgotten how to look at the person standing in front of you. That landed. His face hardened, not with anger so much as the instinct to close a door before something could enter. A man knows when he's standing somewhere he doesn't belong. Rosalie looked around his cabin, her dress drying beside his stove, her repaired stitches on the glove hanging from his peg, 2 coffee cups, a biscuit tin she'd given him last Christmas, 3 years scattered around one room in objects neither of them had thought to count. Do you? Graham had no answer. By dawn, the rain had weakened to a cold drizzle. They waited until there was enough gray light to see the creek. Graham saddled his horse and walked beside Rosalie along the muddy track toward Briar Hollow, leading the animal rather than riding. At the shared fence, Rosalie stopped. For one moment, Graham thought she might say what neither of them had managed to say in the cabin. Instead, she opened the gate. Safe ride tomorrow. Graham nodded. Rosalie closed the gate between them. Later that morning, the old foreman found Graham behind his barn tightening a saddle strap. You ask her? Graham kept working. There wasn't anything to ask. That's convenient. Graham looked up. The old man leaned on the fence. A man ought to ask a woman what she wants instead of deciding it for her. I know what Rosalie needs. I didn't ask what she needed. He walked away before Graham could answer. Across the fence at Briar Hollow, Rosalie stood alone in her father's old room. She opened a small wooden box. August's watch lay inside. Beneath it were folded receipts, an old photograph, and papers she had not touched in months. At the bottom was a yellowed envelope. Graham Talbot, her father's handwriting. Rosalie held it without opening it. She had opened the box dozens of times in 2 years. She had touched that envelope almost as many. She had never delivered it. Outside came the faint clink of harness. Through the window she could see Graham beside his horse, bedroll tied behind the saddle. Rosalie closed the box. She took 2 steps toward the door. Stopped. Then went back. August had hidden the mortgage because he thought silence would spare his daughter. Graham had hidden what he felt behind a decision to leave because he thought leaving would spare her. And Rosalie had spent 2 years telling herself that keeping one letter hidden protected Graham's freedom. Different secrets. The same mistake. Outside, Graham pulled the final strap tight. Rosalie took the envelope. By the time she reached the porch, he was leading his horse toward the yard gate. Graham? He stopped. Rosalie crossed the wet yard quickly, boots darkening in the mud. Her breath showed white in the cold air. Graham turned toward. She stopped several feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rosalie raised the old yellowed envelope between them. Her hand was trembling. Then I guess I can't keep this secret any longer. Graham looked at the name on the envelope. His own. He knew the handwriting. August? Rosalie nodded. Graham took the letter slowly. The paper had yellowed along the folds, and the seal had been broken years ago. He opened it. The yard went quiet except for his horse breathing behind him and rainwater dripping from the porch roof. August had written only days before his death. He wrote that his health had been failing longer than he'd admitted. He wrote that Graham was one of the few men he'd trusted with a frightened horse, a hard decision, or an honest account of money. Then came the part Graham read twice. August had intended to offer him a genuine share in Briar Hollow. Not charity, not wages, partnership. But August had noticed something else. Graham had stayed longer than Graham himself seemed willing to acknowledge. Rosalie had begun looking for him whenever trouble came. And Graham, August wrote, had developed the habit of watching for Rosalie whenever he believed nobody was watching him. The final lines were plain. If there's something there worth asking about, don't make my daughter your excuse for running from the answer. Ask her what she wants. Graham lowered the paper. His eyes went to the date, then to Rosalie. You've had this 2 years. Yes, 2 years. I know. Why? Rosalie folded her arms tightly. At first I told myself it was because Father had no right to decide your future after he was gone. If you stayed, I wanted it to be because you chose to. That sounds reasonable. It sounded reasonable to me, too. Graham waited. Rosalie looked down. It wasn't my letter to keep. I knew that every day I kept it. Then why? She took a breath. If I gave it to you and you left anyway, I'd know. Know what? Her eyes lifted to his. That it was me you didn't want. Graham said nothing. Rosalie did not look away this time. I called it protecting your choice because that sounded better than admitting I was afraid of your answer. The anger went out of his face. He looked at the letter again. My mother left when I was young enough I can't remember her face proper. My father followed ranch work from one county to another until it finally wore him down. Rosalie listened. I was 19 when I figured out the easiest way not to be left. Leave first, Graham nodded. No roots, no promises. Never stay anywhere long enough to find out folks can do perfectly well without you. He looked toward his saddled horse. I told myself leaving Briar Hollow was for you. And now? Maybe leaving was simply easier than asking you to give me a reason not to. Rosalie's mouth tightened into the faintest sad smile. And maybe keeping quiet was easier than giving you the chance to say no. They stood there with August's letter between them. At last Graham asked the question that should have been asked years before. Do you want me to stay? Rosalie looked past him toward the shared fence, the barn, the wet road between their two homes. I've wanted you to ask me that for 2 years. Graham took half a step toward her. Rosalie stopped him with a small shake of her head. But not because Father asked you. Not because you think you owe me. And not because you believe Briar Hollow can't stand without you. She opened the house door. Come inside. At the kitchen table, Rosalie opened August's old ledger. Horse sales filled page after page. Beside them were bank receipts Graham had never seen. The gray mare had only been the beginning. Rosalie turned to the final figures. The mortgage isn't gone. Graham studied the balance. But it's close. Close enough that I never needed Bellamy's money. He looked at her. Why didn't you tell me? Rosalie gave a tired little laugh. Apparently, carrying things alone runs in my family. By afternoon, Warren Bellamy rode through the Briar Hollow gate. He saw Graham's horse still saddled near the house, and understood more than either of them said. You're choosing sentiment over security, Bellamy told Rosalie. No. She closed the ledger. I'm choosing for myself. Bellamy glanced toward Graham. You'll remember this choice when winter comes. Rosalie met his eyes calmly. I've survived winters. When Bellamy made one last remark about what Graham could offer, Rosalie cut him short. You've mistaken having money for being the thing I value. Bellamy had no answer worth giving. He mounted and rode toward the Cheyenne Road without looking back. That evening, Graham and Rosalie sat on the Briar Hollow porch. August's letter rested on the little table between them. The clouds had broken over the foothills. Somewhere beyond the barn, water still ran high in the creek. Neither spoke. For once, silence wasn't hiding anything. But Graham still had not told her he was staying. Rosalie did not ask again. Tomorrow his horse would still be ready. And this time, whatever Graham Talbot did with that saddle had to be entirely his choice. Morning came cold and clear. Rosalie stepped onto the Briar Hollow porch and stopped. Graham's horse stood near the shared fence, saddled, bedroll tied behind the cantle, both saddlebags packed. For one terrible moment she understood. The letter had not been enough. Neither had the truth. 20 years of leaving had won. Graham came from his barn wearing his old brown coat. He crossed the yard toward the horse. Rosalie stayed where she was. She had told him what she wanted. She would not chase him, would not beg, would not turn love into another debt he believed he had to repay. Graham reached the saddlebag. Rosalie looked toward the mountains. Then she heard a buckle open. She turned. Graham lifted the first saddlebag from the horse and set it in the dirt. Then the second. Then the bedroll. Rosalie came down one porch step. "What are you doing?" Graham rested a hand against the empty saddle. "Near 20 years, I've packed a horse every time a place started feeling too much like somewhere I might miss." He looked at her. "I'm tired of practicing leaving." Rosalie said nothing. Graham crossed the yard until only a few feet remained between them. "I found somewhere worth staying." Her eyes shone, but her voice remained steady. "Briar Hollow?" Graham shook his head. "You." That was all. No grand speech. No promise made because August had written a letter. Just one man standing in the cold morning with his belongings in the dirt behind him. Rosalie reached for his hand. This time their fingers touched. Graham stayed on his own homestead after that. There was no hurried wedding and no sudden combining of everything they owned. They courted plainly. Sunday suppers became intentional instead of accidental. Graham stopped finding excuses to leave before dark. Rosalie stopped pretending the second coffee cup had been poured by mistake. One frosty morning he handed her the first cup as usual. "Why do you always do that?" she asked. "Been waiting 3 years for you to notice." Rosalie took it. "I noticed." By summer, the last of August Fenwick's mortgage was paid. Rosalie carried the final receipt home from town, tucked safely inside her ledger. She placed it beside August's watch and sat quietly for a while before closing the box. Briar Hollow was hers, free and clear. Only then did Graham make his next choice. At the bank, he used savings gathered through 20 years of cattle work and careful living to purchase a legal interest in Briar Hollow. Rosalie looked at the papers. "You didn't need to do this. Father meant you to have a share." "I know." "Then why pay for it?" Graham took the pen. "Your father wanted me to have the chance." He signed his name. "I made the choice." They married that autumn. Cold wind came down from the Wyoming foothills while neighbors crowded around Briar Hollow. The old foreman stood witness. Horses moved beyond the fence and tables were filled with pies, bread, roast beef, preserves, and coffee brought from half the valley. Mrs. Pruitt arrived carrying an enormous sack. Rosalie stared at it. "Coffee?" "Measured for 2. Rosalie laughed. Later the old foreman raised his glass toward Graham. "Told you to ask her." "You did. Took you 3 years." Graham looked across the table at his wife. "Worth getting the answer right." Years passed. Briar Hollow became known for Rosalie's horses, especially the descendants of the difficult gray mare nobody once believed could be gentled. One autumn evening, their daughter found an old yellowed envelope in the parlor box beside August's watch. "Why'd you keep this?" Rosalie turned the envelope over in her hands. "Because I nearly kept it too long." "What made you finally give it to Papa?" Rosalie looked through the window. Graham was outside beside the pasture fence, older now, one boot resting on the lower rail, while the horses moved through gold autumn grass. "Sometimes there's no perfect time to tell the truth," she said. "There's only the last moment before it's too late." She placed the letter back beside August's watch and went outside. Graham heard her coming. He held out his hand without turning. Rosalie took it. Near the barn stood Graham's horse, saddled for the day's work. There was no bedroll behind the saddle, no packed bags, nothing waiting for another town. The storm had once brought Rosalie running to Graham's door because she needed shelter for one night. It had not made them love each other. August's letter had not made Graham stay. Briar Hollow had survived without Bellamy's money. Rosalie had saved her father's land with her own skill and work. Graham had been free to ride west and begin again. That freedom was what made the choice matter. A cowboy who had spent 20 years leaving before anyone could miss him finally stayed. And the black woman beside him had never needed rescuing. She had only needed him to stop deciding for her long enough to ask what she wanted. The answer was there in the pasture, in the ranch they now shared, in the weathered fence between two pieces of land that no longer felt like a boundary. Graham squeezed her hand. Rosalie leaned gently against his shoulder. Beyond them, the gray mare's descendants broke into a run beneath the Wyoming mountains, and Graham Talbot watched them without once looking toward the road. Maybe that's the part of their story worth carrying with us. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't surviving the storm. It's opening the door after you've spent years protecting yourself. It's asking someone what they truly want instead of deciding for them. It's finding the courage to say, stay, while still giving them the freedom to leave. Imagine yourself standing where Rosalie stood that cold morning, watching the person you love walk toward a saddled horse, knowing you've already said all you can say. Or imagine being Graham, with an open road ahead and 20 years of habit telling you to take it. Sometimes love asks for courage in quieter ways, a hand held out, a truth finally spoken, a saddlebag taken down, a second cup of coffee poured, because somewhere along the way, one life has made room for another. Perhaps that's what second chances really are. Not opportunities to erase what frightened or wounded us, but chances to stop letting those old wounds choose our future. If you've ever had someone worth staying for, or wished you'd found the courage to tell them before it was too late, I'd love to hear what this story brought to mind for you in the comments. And if stories of frontier love, healing, mystery, and ordinary people finding their way home mean something to you, you're warmly invited to subscribe. There are more stories waiting down the trail. Until we meet again, may you recognize what is worth holding on to, and have the courage to stay when your heart finally knows it's home.